There'll be a table of like, these are all the times. I don't want to use like statistics jargon, even though every Pinkbike reader is an engineer. When the UCI scrapped the rule which banned mixed wheel sizes for racing, a lot of teams scrambled to experiment with mixed wheel size bikes, which have now become known pretty much universally as mullets. In the early days, most people were running either a 27.5-inch bike with a 29er front wheel and fork, or they're running a 29er bike with a 27.5-inch rear wheel. So a couple of years ago, my colleague Mike Casimir experimented with using a 29er bike with both a 29 and 27.5-inch rear wheel, and the results were inconclusive. Neither bike was outright faster. But with these setups, you had to compromise the geometry to accommodate the mixed wheel sizes. If you use a 27.5-inch rear wheel in a 29er bike, the bottom bracket height is probably going to be a bit too low, and if you fit a 29er fork and front wheel into a 27.5-inch bike, then the BB is probably going to be too high. And either way, the head angle and the seat angle are probably going to be a bit too slack, certainly slacker than what the bike was designed for. These days, however, when people talk about a mullet bike, they're usually talking about a bike that is designed around the smaller rear wheel. So these allow you to have the mixed wheel sizes without any compromises in geometry. There are an increasing number of bikes designed to fit either rear wheel size, such as this Geometron G1. By using flip chips, it can accommodate either rear wheel size without changing the geometry at all. And because on this bike the flip chips sit between the rocker link and the rear axle, instead of between the rocker link and the shock, the leverage curve and the suspension kinematics are pretty similar with both wheel sizes too. I've been testing this bike with both wheel setups here at the Forest of Dean on a couple of different tracks. The first track starts with a series of fairly tight corners that are quite awkward to carry speed through before it drops into a fast section with a series of really big roots before it drops onto a fly road. I know this track really well, and I did 5 scoping runs on the day to get fully up to speed before I got the stopwatch out. Then I did 2 runs on the mullet, then 4 on the 29er, then 2 more on the mullet. This was to further minimize the effect of just learning the track and potentially getting faster as the day went on. The results? Well, I was very slightly faster on average on the 29er, where my average time was 49.5 seconds versus 49.9 seconds on the mullet. So there was about half a second in it, or 1%. It's not statistically significant though, so it could just be a fluke. But subjectively, what surprised me most was how similar the two bikes felt in the turns. When swapping from the 29er back to the mullet, I did notice that it was a little bit more willing to tip into the turn. I don't necessarily think it's better, it's just different, and I only really noticed it on the first couple of turns after swapping over, so I think you learn to compensate for it very quickly. So perhaps the 29er is a bit like having a car with slightly heavier steering, in that it takes a little bit more effort to initiate the turn, but you can go around corners just as quickly. But the main takeaway is that the difference is very subtle indeed. In fact, in a blind test, I'm not 100% sure I could tell the difference at all. But either way, I don't think it was faster through the turns, and that's certainly what the stopwatch suggested. The main area where I did notice a difference was at the bottom on those big chunky roots, where the 29er just seemed to hang up a little less. It felt easier to ride smoothly and carry speed out of those roots and into the next section. This shouldn't come as too much of a surprise because while some people have painted mullet bikes as the best of both worlds, the fact is that unless you're on the brakes, about 60% of your weight is on the rear wheel. And also the rear wheel is more likely to be dragged through the worst of the kind of holes and bumps. So having a smaller rear wheel is quite a disadvantage in terms of carrying speed. So for my second test track, I decided to try and find a track where the benefits of the mullet were more likely to shine through so that I could find out if the mullet is faster on at least some types of terrain. I picked a short track with a good gradient to it, which is basically a series of nice, tight corners. There's almost no time spent not cornering. These tight alternating turns are where I thought the mullet was most likely to come into its own. And because the track is so short, that meant I could do lots of runs in quick succession and get really familiar with the trail, which is really important for noticing subtle differences in handling. But once again, both setups felt pretty similar to me. I really don't think in a blind test I'd be able to tell the difference. And the stopwatch seemed to agree. This time I tested the 29 first, then the mullet then back to the 29, so the same ABA pattern but in the reverse order to the previous track. The average time was almost identical, and the difference between those times was very small compared to the range of times that I recorded for either wheel setup. So essentially, there's no difference. So this test doesn't really paint mullets in a particularly good light, but that's not to say they don't have their place. One of the main advantages of a mullet is probably for shorter riders. So I'm 190 centimeters tall, or 6'3", so I never buzz my ass on the rear tire. But for some riders, this is a real problem. I still suspect that really short riders could benefit from a full 27.5-inch setup so that they can get their bar height low enough. But if you're in the in-between size where you can get the bar height in the right place with a 29er front end, but you still want that smaller rear wheel so that it doesn't buzz your ass, then a mullet makes a lot of sense. But when it comes to the supposed benefits of faster turning and better cornering agility, I think that the difference is very subtle at best and very easy to adapt to. Some people I know swear that there's a benefit here, and maybe they're right, but for me, with the height I am, the riding style that I have, I really can't feel it. Nor could I tell a difference with the stopwatch, and that's despite going out of my way to try and find terrain likely to benefit the mullet setup. I wonder if in some cases people have tested the kind of ghetto mullet setup that we mentioned at the start, which gives you a slacker head angle, and that gives you more wheel flop, which might help the bike to sort of tip into the corners. Or if they're running a smaller rear wheel in a 29er bike, that will lower the bottom bracket height, get your center of mass a bit lower, and that could help you to change direction more quickly as well. But in this test, all that's really changing is the height of the rear axle and the weight and rotational speed of the rear wheel. So 29er wheels are heavier, but they also rotate more slowly for a given speed on the trail. As far as I can see, this doesn't have a huge effect on how the bike handles. After all, a 29er wheel is only about 5% larger than a 27.5. It's not like we're talking about a penny farthing here. The main difference I can feel is that the 29er still hangs up a bit less, particularly on very rough terrain. It's worth saying also that I've tested on both of these tracks before, back-to-backing things like fork offset or suspension settings or tire sizes, and I noticed a far bigger difference with many of those things. Now I can already hear Mike Levy asking, but what about climbing? And there I really did notice a big difference. Obviously the 29er helps a little bit with getting up and over kind of square edge bumps, but by far the main difference I noticed is that the smaller wheel gives you an easier gear. And this is literally the biggest difference I noticed in the whole test. So what do you think? Are you into the mullet thing, or do you think it's just a gimmick? Once you've had a chance to mull it over, let me know why I'm wrong in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe.